you run a big MLOps survey. Do you want to tell us about some of the big insights from that?
Your listeners, I imagine, are smart and they've not been disillusioned, or they are disillusioned with seeing on social media how every time a new model comes out, it's like, it beats all the benchmarks. You're like, these benchmarks mean absolutely nothing to me anymore. The evaluation survey was to try and put that into perspective and see how people are evaluating. And is there anything that's working? Is there stuff out there that is knowledge that we don't know about? A data scientist at a fintech company versus a data scientist at a bank versus a data scientist at a 5-person startup, the job description and what they're expected to be doing is universes apart, right? And so now you have that same thing happening. It's just with the new term AI engineer.
Demetrios with the Super Data Science Podcast. I am stoked to have you here on the show. Where are you calling in from today?
Right outside of Frankfurt, Germany. And I've got to say, this is a monumental podcast. I just heard that we are on episode number 787. So congrats to you for making it this far.
Thank you. Yeah, super grateful to obviously listeners, which are critical to enabling us to have the show. So thanks to everyone for listening. And maybe even more important, though, I think these are all kind of necessary conditions, is the team that works on the show is unbelievable. So we do 2 episodes a week every single week of the year.
Wow.
And so basically no one takes time off to make this show happen all year round. And so I'm so grateful to everyone. And it's also amazing. Everyone who works on the show, we can trust them 100% to execute on their piece to the highest level of professionalism. We don't need to be double checking things. And so it just makes everything, for me, people are like, how do you do this on top of your day job? And I'm like, actually, I'm like the 5th or 6th most important person working on the show.
That's incredible, man. And that's so cool that you've got this well-oiled system.
Nice. Yeah. And I also can't take credit for that. That's Kirill Eremenko who founded the show. He put the system in place and the key people, and I just slot in and talk.
Yeah, you get to draft off of his crazy abilities to create that system. I like it.
Exactly. Yeah. Also, you are the leader of the MLOps community with capital letters. MLOps community. It's not like a MLOps community. It's the MLOps community, capital C. So you are the person to ask this question. What is exactly MLOps?
Ooh, what's MLOps? I thought you were going to go down the rabbit hole of what's a community, which is another fun one we could do also. And I think the best way that I've heard MLOps described is so basically you can put a machine learning model into production, but then when you want to put N+1 models into production, that is MLOps. And the whole ecosystem, processes, everything around getting a sustainable and repeatable process to put models into production, and then making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, that's MLOps.
Nice. That was a really great, concise description. I feel like when people ask questions like that, you often get really long answers. And that was just crisp and perfect. I love it. There's a term that you and I were discussing just before we started recording, which I thought was cool and new and growing, and you think actually was kind of a blip and is no longer cool. Nobody's using it, which is LLMOps, so large language model ops, which was, I thought, kind of like a specialized MLOps person. So you described MLOps there as being someone who puts models into production in a repeatable way, getting model weights updated in production, ensuring the models aren't drifting away from their original purpose, the data aren't drifting. And so LLMOps, I thought, involved extra specialization in order to be able to handle the typically billions, sometimes now even trillions of model parameters that we have when we're training and deploying a large language model. So it seemed like there was kind of this extra specialization there in LLM ops. But yeah, you say that it's not really a term that's taking off anymore.
Well, So let me be clear on the idea of, I think there definitely is something, and there's a difference between working and doing platform work with LLMs and making sure that LLMs, when you're incorporating quote unquote AI into your product, that it is doing all these things like we just said, like it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. And it is different than if you're just using like a linear regression model. What I think is, I haven't seen that much anymore. It was very, very hot back in the day, was the term LLMOps. And this is where people can say, and maybe rightly so, like, well, of course, he's just talking his book. Like, I've got the MLOps community. I don't have the LLMOps community. So that that may be true, but I will say that some of the the funniest thing, just a little sidebar, is that one of the people in the community, in the MLOps community, went and got the website domain LLMOps.community and just
Mhm.
redirected it to the MLOps community homepage, which I thought was hilarious.
And that
But
makes perfect sense to me because it seems to me like LLM ops, it's just a subspecialization of
mhm,
ML ops anyway. So,
yeah.
and it would be
And
weird.
so
So, yeah.
what I think is happening is more of less of like the term and more of what you're seeing is who is actually doing the work and what are they calling themselves. And this has been, you've known this for years. A data scientist at a fintech company versus a data scientist at a bank versus a data scientist at a 5-person startup, the job description and what they're expected to be doing is universes apart, right? And so now you have that same thing happening. It's just with the new term AI engineer. And we've had all these different terms come up over the past 4 or 5 years, whether it's a data scientist or a full stack data scientist or an ML engineer or an applied AI scientist or I've even heard like deep learning engineer, all of these different terms. And now it seems like there's a lot of consolidation or people are agreeing on the idea of an AI engineer. What I and an AI engineer, I think, is starting to be like, well, is it someone that just prompts a model and then can like add some front end to that? That person can call themselves an AI engineer, or is it a platform engineer that typically is looked at as like someone that's doing ML ops work and they're putting not only linear regression models into production, they're also able to take like a Mistral or a Llama and then add that to the platform. And so there's a huge spectrum of what it is. And coming back to the question of like, oh, is LLM ops a thing? I just haven't heard it that much as like before. And especially a year ago, it was very hot. It was so hot that I was like, do I need to rebrand? What's going on here? And now I'm not too worried about the whole rebrand thing.
Nice. Wow, that's wild. Yeah, so I guess I'm living in the past, a year ago, back in the day, as you said. So now, so this is an interesting thing because you also highlighted. I thought that LLM ops would clearly be a subset of ML ops, which it sounds like it is. And to me, some of the other terms that you were describing, like ML engineer, AI engineer, deep learning engineer, I I before you said it, I kind of thought of those things as a separate role. But it sounds like there might be a lot of overlap, or in fact, they are the same thing after all.
I think they're separate roles, and it's just that it's really hard to be clear on what exactly you're looking for and what you're trying to get. And the way I should be, I should probably say that it's when people are f- putting jobs up and putting in the job description, like what they expect from this role, right? That's where you're getting all these different job descriptions and you're getting these different roles. And so if they're two separate jobs, like I would say, yeah, you're looking at a bit of a subset. LLM ops can be viewed as a subset of ML ops. What happens is, and what I think is a great unlock, is that you can have people that are front end engineers or full stack developers that now all of a sudden can leverage. Even product managers, I've been seeing that a ton. Like someone who is a product engineer, they can now leverage AI and they can use a few of these tools like LlamaIndex or Ollama, and they can incorporate AI features into their product really quickly. And they do a little bit of orchestration, they do a little bit of evaluation, and that is what I think could be called LLMOps. And so there's that huge unlock that has happened now because I think I saw a slide from the CEO of Vercel. What's his name? Guillerme or something. And he was talking about how because of this whole new paradigm shift, you now have 25 million developers that can leverage AI. And when it was just ML, you had maybe like less than a million, maybe a million people that were leveraging it. So that's where the paradigm shift is. And that's why I think with LLM ops, there was a lot of attention and interest there because of the democratization.
This is really interesting. So LLM ops, despite sounding like a subspecialization, because it is leveraging LLMs, which make using code or interacting with systems suddenly now so much more intuitive for users, for developers, because now you have natural language interfaces to code or machine capabilities that greatly broadened the number of people, the number of developers that could be making impactful products with AI.
Yeah, I look at the
Interesting.
story of Philip, my friend Philip Carter from Honeycomb, and he wrote a great blog post all about like the hard part of LLMs that nobody's talking about. And basically, he was saying,
Yes, that was super popular.
yeah, it was
Yeah.
incredible. I loved it. I think it struck a chord with a lot of people because they were feeling that pain, and he just like put words to the pain that everyone was feeling. And something that I noticed is that he's a product engineer and he never messed around with ML before LLMs came out. But then all of a sudden, he's like, wait, we can add this into our product. And now people can, they're an observability tool. Now people can just like type in natural language what they want done, and we can try and make that happen. And so he added LLMs or AI capabilities into the product, him as like a product engineer, right? And so that type of stuff doesn't really happen on the ML side. I don't think it's as common.
This episode of Super Data Science is brought to you by AWS Trainium and Inferentia, the ideal accelerators for generative AI. AWS Trainium and Inferentia chips are purpose-built by AWS to train and deploy large-scale models. Whether you are building with large language models or latent diffusion models, you no longer have to choose between optimizing performance or lowering costs. Learn more about how you can save up to 50% on training costs and up to 40% on inference costs with these high-performance accelerators. We have all the links for getting started right away in the show notes. Awesome. Now back to our show. Yeah, really great blog post by Philip Carter there called All the Hard Stuff Nobody Talks About When Building Products with LLMs. We'll be sure to include a link to that blog post in the show notes. But I also did an episode of this podcast exclusively on the content from
Oh,
that
nice.
post. So that was Super Data Science episode number 688, 6 Reasons Why Building LLM Products is Tricky.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you highlighted that again for us. Demetrios, uh, that was a great dive deeper into this LLM ops, ML ops distinction, and I think it provided a lot of insight into how LLMs are changing software development and getting models deployed and product development changed in general. But I feel like the thing that I was trying to distinguish there, which I'm not sure we got much insight into, was this difference between like ML engineer and ML ops. What do you think about that one?
Mm. So yeah, my fault on being on muddy in my answers and going on total tangents. I digress. That's
No, that was
your
super
job.
interesting. I'm glad we got all that out of you.
So I would say that is again like the job title. It's so funny that you mentioned that because an ML engineer can be someone that works on the platform and does ML ops, and it feels like that's more of what is expected from ML engineers, but it's not always. And sometimes like ML engineers, they'll you'll see a job posting for an ML engineer, but really it's a data scientist who does machine learning.
So yeah, so the ML engineer might, in a larger organization with enough people, might sit between the data scientist and the ML ops person. Where so the data scientist might be working completely offline and training the model weights offline. Then the ML engineer is tinkering with that model, maybe writing it using a completely different library to make it performant in production. And then the ML ops person takes that production code that the ML engineer put together and puts it into production and makes sure that the way that that happens is repeatable, that there's great operations around it. And a key term here, which I think to you as the leader of the MLOps community, there's a term that you've used a few times that I think is so obvious to you, but a bit nebulous, even to me, is you said someone in MLOps is working on the platform. What does that mean, working on the platform?
That's just the velocity of being able to take an idea and put it into production. That is that platform that is there for you to go from exploration mode in a Jupyter notebook to battle hardened code that is being monitored and can be retrained. And when it starts to drift, it can be retrained. So that is what I consider the platform. Like platform
Very
engineers feel
cool.
like, yeah, ML platform engineer is another term that you'll hear thrown around. So you get a little bit of everything, I think, and that's because it is still so new that people are trying to figure out, okay, what do we need and what kind of person is going to help us get there? Let's try and create a job title for that.
Nice. So platform is kind of like the system. It's like setting up the system, setting up the operations. Cool, cool, cool. Nice. That is actually that is a bit of mind expansion on my part there. A couple of tools that you mentioned as you were describing, particularly LLM ops people, are tools that I've heard of but haven't used much myself. LlamaIndex and Ollama. What are those, and why should our listeners know about them?
Mm. So there is what feels like a stack that's happening in the LLM space. And so Ollama does a lot, lets you do a lot of large language model stuff on your own computer. And LlamaIndex is like an orchestration tool. So it allows you to take all of your data and do stuff with that. It's on the same layer or kind of plays in the same space as what I imagine a lot of people have heard of, like LlamaIndex. Sorry, we're talking about LlamaIndex, LangChain, and then another one that is in that space, which I think is gaining a lot of popularity right now, is DSPy. And so those will help you like chain prompts together and get the right prompt templates and then send it out. And then you've got the tools that will help you either host the large language model or you just hit an API that is the open AI API or some third party API to make your life easier. And really, it's about abstracting away all that hard engineering so that you just have to be like, all right, I'm going to write some code and I can get to product and MVP much faster. I don't need to worry about like how to set this up so that I can serve it to hundreds of thousands of requests per second. I just need to hit this API and then I'm good.
Very cool. Love that. So yeah, so LlamaIndex, Ollama, LangChain, and I hadn't heard of DSPy yet, so it's great. I mean, this is why it's so great having a show like
Yeah.
this because we can hear from people like you who are right on the front line and now, yeah, know about these tools that make working with LLMs easier so that we don't have to worry about scaling as much. Um, awesome. And before we started recording, related to you being on the front lines and having a real finger on the pulse of what's going on in MLOps, you run a big MLOps survey. Do you want to tell us about some of the big insights from that, or where people can access the survey, either your analysis or even the raw data?
Yeah. So the survey we started when we started doing these virtual conferences, and it was all around using LLMs in production. It's like I had been hearing a bunch about the advent of, all right, cool. Now we've got OpenAI and GPT 3, 3.5 is out. ChatGPT is changing the world. But I wanted to see who's actually doing stuff with this and how, because I couldn't wrap my head around it. I was trying as hard as I could, and I had on one hand people saying, wow, AI is going to change everything. This is like the invention of the internet all over again. And so I had played with it, and I would ask it questions like, is the earth flat, and get answers like, yeah, it is. And some people say it is. So this was back in the early days, and I'm like, who's actually doing stuff with this in their products? How are they doing it? And so we started having these virtual conferences to just get people that were creating products and putting out information on it. And through that, since we would get a lot of people to these conferences, we ended up started trying to do stuff with the attention that we had on those days. So it would be like during the virtual conference, we would run surveys. And the first survey that we did was all about LLMs in production. And that was like almost a year ago now. And it really was just trying to figure out what's going on. How are people using these models? What's the use cases? What models are you using? What's the challenging parts about it? What do you not like? What is easy? Why do you like it? All that kind of stuff and the questions. And we made sure to open source all the data. So I think there was 200, 250 people that filled out the survey, which by the way, if anybody's ever done a survey before, getting people to actually sit through like 15, 20 minutes of filling out surveys, and a lot of these questions were open-ended answers. That's hard work, man. But I digress. The next survey that we did on the next conference was all about evaluation, because it became very clear that one of the biggest and most painful pieces of working with LLMs is, how do you trust them and how do you evaluate them? And how do you know if they're doing what they should be doing? And so, again, we created the survey all around evaluation, how you evaluate your system, not just the model, because I think a lot of people probably know this. Your listeners, I imagine, are smart, and they've not been disillusioned, or they are disillusioned with seeing on social media how every time a new model comes out, it's like it beats all the benchmarks. You're like, these benchmarks mean absolutely nothing to me anymore, because every single model, no matter who comes out with what, it beats the benchmarks, and it's now SOTA. And so I'm like, all right, SOTA, everything is SOTA now. So the evaluation survey was to try and put that into perspective and see how people are evaluating, and is there anything that's working? Is there stuff out there that is knowledge that we don't know about, and we can share it with the greater community? And so we did the survey, and again, we made sure to make all of the data open source, and so you can see it. It's very rudimentary. It's just in an Excel or a Google Sheets spreadsheet with all the answers, but you get a really clear picture of why it's difficult, what people are doing, where the old standards and old ways of evaluating things, old in quotations, like the ways of evaluating machine learning. We're trying to do that with AI, but it's not quite as simple as that. And so it was eye opening, and we'll leave the links to all this in there. But it's been great. I take on each of these surveys that we did, I just go through it. I spend a lot of time trying to understand what people are saying. And then I'll usually write a blog post. On the first one, I wrote a whole report about it. And so it's a lot of fun, and it helps me understand where we're at, like as a community and as practitioners.
Nice. Very cool. Yeah, we look forward to sharing those results with everyone and allowing all of our data analysts, data scientists listening, and curious people be able to analyze the raw data themselves. And thank you for the key insights from there. It is It's a tricky situation with this every LLM coming out, breaking the benchmarks, and becoming the state of the art, the SOTA. It's uh, it's so tricky because how can we do better? You see interesting things like, okay, there was a recent Grok release from X.ai, an Elon Musk outfit associated with Twitter and using Twitter data. And this new Grok model, it has visual capabilities like GPT-4V. And so they created a new benchmark. And they're like, wow, look, on our new benchmark, this is the best model in the world. And in some ways, I'm like, okay, cool. That's actually one good way of doing it. One good way of having these benchmarks is like literally inventing new benchmarks every time so that you can be somewhat confident that people aren't training their models specifically to excel at, say, MMLU. But on the other hand, the obvious hack in that situation is if you're working at X.ai, you can create a training validation split and have the most perfect training data for fine tuning just to that task that no one else does because you made the evaluation. So it's tricky. All right. So it sounds like you are trying to do everything you can to answer this question. You are organizing the AI Quality Conference, which is coming up shortly on June 25th in San Francisco, AI QConf. Can you expand on what's going on with this conference? Yeah, it sounds like this problem that we're describing maybe is kind of the genesis of having the whole conference.
Yeah, and so this one is the first time that we're doing it in person, which if you would have told me beforehand, I may not have actually decided to do it. Like knowing what I know now, in-person stuff, wow, I'm used to the online version, and having
Uh,
a 6-8 hour live stream is way different than the in-person. And I knew it was going to be hard. I did not realize it was going to be this hard, but it is fun, man. Like learning a ton just every day, getting in stand up with the team and figuring out how we're going to make this the best event possible. And so, one thing that we're doing, which I'm very excited about, and as you said, kind of coming off the back of this, realizing that evaluation is one piece, evaluating models is one thing, but also evaluating the system, not just the model, is another thing. And so, how can we make sure that AI is doing what it's supposed to be doing? And that is what AI quality means to us. At the end of the day, AI quality is, does the AI work as intended? And so we are planning on not only having this conference to talk about ways that people are doing this and get together with a bunch of people, that this is top of mind for everyone at the conference. And I think that's one thing that's really cool, is that you see there are a lot of people thinking through this and making sure that, like, okay, I'm using AI, but I need to make sure that it's doing what it says it's doing. Or how do I know that if I'm going to put something into production, I can trust that it's not going to like do some things that could potentially put my company into hot water? And one way that we're going to do that is, on the day of the conference, we're going to kick off a whole project to create these like gold standards. And so you have the industry wide standards, but then you have the use cases. And what we want to do is say, all right, you're in finance and you have a chat bot that's using AI. You need to have certain gold standards and quality standards around that chatbot. And so, can we try and just see what the use cases are and what the industries are and create working groups, and 9 months later come out with some standards that at least make it so people understand, all right, we've got a chatbot, let's make sure that we're hitting these standards that have been set out there, right? And so, like, leaders from their team, or leaders can tell their teams, here's some standards we want to try and work towards.
Data science and machine learning jobs increasingly demand cloud skills, with over 30% of job postings listing cloud skills as a requirement today, and that percentage set to continue growing. Thankfully, Krohn and Atle, who have taught machine learning to millions of students, have now launched CloudWolf
to efficiently provide you with the essential cloud computing skills. With CloudWolf, commit just 30 minutes a day for 30 days and you can obtain your official AWS certification badge. Secure your career's future. Join now at cloudwolf.com/SDS for a whopping 30% membership discount. Again, that's cloudwolf.com/SDS to start your cloud journey today.
Nice. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I can't imagine how difficult it is to organize an in-person conference, especially the first time. I think maybe after you've done it the first time, you're like, okay, we're going to go back to the same venue. We know some of the people over there. We know which food vendors we're going to work with or whatever. And then, so there's like some pieces, but the first time, yeah, it's got to be a nightmare. Our researcher, Serge Massis, pulled out a quote from you recently that you said that organizing this conference has taken years off of your life.
Great on Serge. He definitely, it was not wrong. I was not lying when I said that. That's I feel like I am happy that I never was a smoker, because the effect of organizing this conference is basically like as if I were smoking 2 packs a day.
Wow. Crazy. But you're organizing it with Mohammed El Gendi, the
Yeah.
CEO of Kalina. It's a cool
Yeah.
company. They sponsored the show in the past.
Nice. So
Yeah.
it's very cool. And Mohammed is the one that back in 2020, even, he came on our podcast and he was talking about how you need like testing for ML. And now I think it's very common for people to understand, okay, you need some kind of change management solutions when you're playing around with data. When you're doing things in ML, you need to make sure that if you're going to put something into production, you test it in every way possible before it goes out there. Otherwise, you are left with that situation that can wind you up in the headlines, right? And you don't want that. Nobody wants to be in the headlines for bad AI uses.
Yeah, for sure. So we've already talked a lot about MLOps, LLMOps. Um, in terms of other kind of related titles that I didn't get into, so we got into ML engineering, but speaking of Serge, he also brought up for me here that another title that we see related to this, and maybe this is kind of one of the easier ways of explaining what MLOps is through the lens of DevOps, which we
Mhm.
haven't mentioned here. So, is it fair to say that software development is to DevOps as machine learning is to MLOps?
Ooh, I like that. I hadn't thought about it that way, but yeah. And I also think that MLOps is like a subset of DevOps, if we want to put it that way,
Right.
because the thing that it's easy to get caught up in is thinking that MLOps is just like implementing some tools and then you're good. But really, it's that organizational level and having the reliability, having the ability to like put things into production quickly and roll them back if you need to, but recognizing it's not just like a tooling aspect, it is an organizational aspect. And so I think DevOps has a lot of that organizational culture. And when when you're looking at DevOps too, there was another thing that I was going to say. The whole idea, I'm just big on this because I was just thinking about it today. DevOps has a lot of like change management. So when you make changes to code, you have a process, and it's very mature process that goes into that, right? Like you change code and then you have unit tests and you have integration tests and you have somebody that's merging the branch and maybe you look over it. And so there's a human in the loop, and then you roll it out slowly. And so you can do some kind of like feature flags so that this new code goes into production and you make sure that it doesn't take down the whole website or take down the whole app, whatever it is. And then you have other tools that can monitor if that new feature or that piece of code is actually being used by users. Like none of that exists when it comes to data. Where is all that? So when it comes to data, data's changing all the time and people are making changes to data all the time, whether it's like way upstream or downstream. And so what is happening, and I just had a conversation with Chad Sanderson about this, and this is why it's like top of mind for me is because that all affects your quality downstream. Data's changing continuously, but there's no integration test, there's no unit test, there's no type of like feature flag on rolling out these data changes. There's no type of monitoring if the data is actually being used later on or the new data streams. It just like can break things. And you see that in a broken ML model that now is making bad predictions, or it's going insanely slow for some reason, or it's just like not hitting the mark, or you see it in like a broken dashboard. You see it at the end product. And so it's funny to me that going back to like DevOps and that whole idea of change management and having these processes in place so that when you do change something, you can still have the reliability that you are going to be able to push out this change and you don't have to get a call at 3 a.m.
Yeah, I think one of the really tricky things here for MLOps relative to DevOps, keying in a little bit more on what you're saying, I think, is that with DevOps, when you have some production issue, it can be reliably traced back to something deterministic in code. But when you've got a machine learning model in production, you update the model weights, and there can be really subtle failure modes in really specific circumstances based on some specific kind of prompt or types of prompts that your users are providing or some upstream process is providing. And so it's really tricky because you can't just, if you're working with a large language model with billions of parameters, you can't be like, oh, here's the parameter that changed since that model weight update, and that's why we're getting this issue. It's like it's a black box.
So exactly, that brings up a little tangent, but it's a conversation that I had with Verena Weber, and she was working on Amazon Alexa, and she was talking about how when they would update, they would fine tune the Alexa model, and when that would happen, they wanted to make sure that they didn't have what she was calling negative flips, and so she explained the story of how imagine what you're used to saying to Alexa. Now there's an update that got pushed to the on air, and you're used to asking, all right, play Taylor Swift. And then out of nowhere, for 90% of the people, that phrase no longer works because you push some update in, and oh, now it catches, it's much better at X amount of phrases, but now it doesn't do the thing that a lot of people really want it to do. So she mentioned how they combated that, and it is very fascinating to think about how you just can't dig into those gigantic models and say, oh, here's the root cause of the problem, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's tricky, and you're certainly you don't want to feel the wrath of the Swifties out there. That's one you got to be careful for.
Oh, imagine how fast, yeah, the internet would explode if your Amazon Alexa stopped recognizing Taylor Swift keyword.
And so, what kind of guidance do you have in terms of processes or tools in order to try to combat these things? This kind of so we want our systems, our software systems, including those involving ML that MLOps people are overseeing. We want them to be redundant. It's critical. We need some robustness. And you, in conversation recently with Neil Leiser, you talked about how we can manage these risks, especially when we're not even always in control of the model ourselves. So in that case, in that example that you just gave with Amazon Alexa, Amazon is responsible for the model weights. But oftentimes, and you talked about this earlier, when we're using tools like Ollama or LlamaIndex, we can be calling third-party APIs like the OpenAI API. And in that case, we have even less control. So what is your guidance for our listeners when they're trying to use third-party APIs in particular, but maybe their own, and trying to have some redundancy, some robustness?
Yeah, I think there's almost like a spectrum of how hard and how difficult do you want to make this? And what's your maturity level, what's your capability, what can your team realistically take on, right? Because if you're just trying to get something, and how fast, like, is this something that you're just testing, or is this something that you know works, you know has a business value, and you want to take it a lot deeper down the rabbit hole and like bring it in house? And so I think I usually will say, and it kind of sucks because I don't like this world where the majority of people are just using some outsourced or some managed service from the clouds, like the three providers. But if you're on step 0 of your journey, then that's probably going to be the easiest route, is just grab the managed service from one of the three big cloud providers, right? Like go with either Bedrock or SageMaker or Vertex or Azure ML. And once you want to go deeper down the rabbit hole, then you can look at, where are we having the most trouble, or where would we like to customize the most? Because as they say, the best part about using SageMaker is that it's a fully managed service. The worst part about using SageMaker is that it's a fully managed service. So it is a blessing and a curse in that way.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. And it's nice to be able to get those specific tool names out there for people to check out. Thank you. Over the next few years, what do you think are going to be key trends or maybe key technologies, key tools that develop in MLOps? Maybe we got a hint there already from you around how you were describing how there are so many fewer data quality evaluation tools relative to the kinds of DevOps tools that are out there.
Yeah, I think that is one piece. I also think one thing that you see, and it's fascinating to me, is how the data engineer plays such a pivotal role in the machine learning lifecycle, and how you really need to be, when you're creating machine learning or AI products, you really should be speaking with all your stakeholders. But data engineers are one of those ones. It's like, I consider them the unsung heroes of this whole AI revolution. And so that's one piece. Like, if you don't know anything about data engineering, that would be a great place to start and get involved there. Start just figuring out pipelines. I think that is one thing, especially data preparation pipelines. That's huge. And that's going to take you so far. And obviously, you've got all the, if you want to play on what I would call like the front, I almost see it as, I don't know if you see this too, man, but this is like before API call or after API call, or like before the model or after the model, because you've got, and that's not the best way of looking at it, but it's almost like you've got, if it's, I consider everything after the model, like the prompt templates and the orchestration and the vector databases and all of that stack that you can look at. And then the before the model is like those data pipelines. And potentially, if you're doing stuff in the ML world, you've got the Jupyter notebooks that you're exploring, and you're just trying to see, is there something valuable here? Can we do that? So, coming back to the question, a very long winded answer. As far as where to go, it depends on where you want to play and where you think you're most excited. Because I could say, all right, we'll go learn some Kubernetes and learn about how to write YAML files, because that's going to be very useful for a platform engineer. Go and figure out SQL, because that's very useful for data engineering. But I don't think you can go wrong if you start to understand the whole data and ML lifecycle, and then you start to really work on like getting pipelines working like they should, data prep pipelines, and just like making sure that you have an understanding there. Deployment is always like a key piece, but it's not as key if you're just planning on hitting an API. And so there's always these little caveats on, what do you think you're going to be doing? And I guess what it comes down to is just get good at learning and expect to have to totally revamp and relearn everything, maybe in a year, maybe in 6 months.
Nice. Makes a lot of sense. Do you have any particular resources that you recommend to people who are just getting started in MLOps?
If you're trying to get into the other side of things, like figuring out the AI engineering or the way to work with large language models, I would also recommend the blogs of like LlamaIndex blog is a great place to start. LangChain blog is also really useful because they show you all of the learnings that they've had. And really, people are we're kind of all in the same boat. If there's somebody that's more advanced or more experienced at this, the cool thing to know is that they're only probably like 6 months more experienced at it than you are. It's very hard to be a expert of 10 years in this because it all came out just so recently.
Nice. That's great. Yeah. And for people beyond just people who are interested in MLOps, growing the community as you have done, the MLOps community from, obviously nothing to over 21,000 members today, lots of diverse backgrounds. Do you have any recommendations for people who would like to build their own community in whatever their area of interest is?
Yes. So first off, communities are incredible. I think they're very special and they pay dividends many times over. It is hard work to get a community that is bought in. And I liken it to catching lightning in a bottle almost because you have to get people interested and spending time and hanging out in the community, helping each other. And community, for those who are wondering, like, oh, what is a community, right? Let's define that first. I would consider a community where you have many to many interactions. So it's not just like one person to many people, like what a podcast or a video would be, right? A community is where you have a lot of people speaking with a lot of people and anyone can join in. And so that's why you traditionally see them on forums, but we also have our in-person meetups that you can go to and you can have those kind of interactions.
And you have a podcast too.
We also have a podcast, yeah. And so, but the podcast, the fun thing is that I don't think people join the MLOps community because of me. So it's not like a creator driven community, which is really good in a way, despite like my ego really wanting it to be that people like me so much. They're like, let's go to his community. Like a lot of other creators have that. I don't have that at all. I'm just some guy that's part of the community and trying to help out, making sure there's not spam being shared all over the place or you don't get like approached by people trying to sell you tools in these places where the many to many conversations are happening. And it just so happens that I also really enjoy podcasting. And so I have a podcast and we have like a blog post where anybody from the community can go and write on our blog. But in the forums and getting people bought into hanging out in a place and fostering that sense of community, I just think you really have to put in an absurd amount of effort, especially in the beginning, to get it off the ground. Because if you don't put in that effort and you don't nurture it in the beginning, it's almost like the snake eating its tail. You get people that might show up, but then there's not really anything happening. It's not really adding that much value. And so then they may go dormant. And then the next group or the next person that shows up doesn't see much value happening. And so it never really gets off the ground. And I've seen that happen with a lot of community efforts. And so that's what I would say. If you're trying to start a community, you have to put in an unreasonable amount of effort and especially in the beginning.
Yeah, yeah, I hear that. It is a tough thing to do, but it sounds like the way that you have this set up where trying to minimize the ego and have it be less about the content creator, more about the community supporting the community, and you ensuring that spam is minimized, that selling is minimized, um, and probably on occasion other unwelcome behaviors are minimized. Yeah, it sounds like the way to go.
Yeah, and I would say, sorry, just to like double click on how to put in that effort or how to get people involved early. One thing that I realized I didn't mention, and it helped me a ton. I'm not sure if it always works for everybody in every scenario, but for me, one thing that I noticed got people more involved and more active in the community was, instead of me answering everything or me going around and giving my thoughts on things, because I was in a really nice situation. I didn't know the answers to a lot of stuff, but when people would come into the community, I would get to know them. And then if I had a cool conversation with them and then a question around whatever these people's expertise were, it came up in the community, I would try and get that person to answer. And so it would either be me going to that person and saying, "Hey, I think you might know the answer to this. Can you like chime in here?" Or I would just tag them in a thread and say, "Oh yeah, I was just having a conversation with John about this." And that way others felt like, all right, it's not just me asking questions and then Demetrius answering.
Nice. Very cool. Yeah, great guidance there. Demetrios, this has been a great episode, eye-opening for me across the spectrum of MLOps and, of course, community building, which we just discussed. Before I let my guests go, I always ask for a book recommendation. What do you have for us?
I love reading, man, and I do it in every form possible. Audio or visual reading or Kindle or iPad, give me whatever. I think that the book that I continuously read, and I read it every day, it's more of like a personal thing and personal growth type thing, is A Course in Miracles. I love that book. And so I was trying to think about like, there's probably a lot of recency bias. I could tell you the last books that I read or the books that I'm reading right now. It's a lot to do with parenting because I have 2 kids. But what I always come back to and I try and start my day with is A Course in Miracles.
That's cool. That is a great recommendation. I love that. Thank you so much for bringing that. And it does seem like you have a lot of peace. Seems like something that maybe you've worked on, but yeah, great to have you bringing that into the world and into the community. Um, Very last question, Demetrios. We know some ways of following you already. Obviously, we've got the podcast. You've got the MLOps community that people can get linked into. What are other ways that people should be following you?
Yeah, I'm probably the most active on LinkedIn, but we do have Twitter and we have like a newsletter too, if anyone is not on social media.
Nice. All right. Thank you so much, man. It has been a wonderful experience, and I look forward to catching up with you again soon. Good luck at the conference coming up.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you having me on here. This is awesome, man.
What a deep dude Demetrios is. He's already accomplished so much, but I have a feeling he's just getting started. In today's episode, Demetrios filled us in on how LLMOps is a subset of MLOps, which itself is a subset of DevOps. He talked about how MLOps focuses on developing the ML platform that allows ML models to be put into production repeatedly and efficiently. He talked about how LlamaIndex, Ollama, LangChain, and DSPy make it easy to work with and to scale up LLMs, and how learning to engineer data pipelines, such as through Kubernetes and YAML files, can be a great starting point for getting going in MLOps yourself. As always, you can get all the show notes, including the transcript for this episode, the video recording, any materials mentioned on the show, the URLs for Demetrios' social media profiles, as well as my own, at superdatascience.com/787. Thanks to my colleagues at Nebula for supporting me while I create content like this Super Data Science episode for you. And thanks, of course, as always, to Ivana, Mario, Natalie, Serge, Sylvia, Zara, and Kirill on the Super Data Science team for producing another informative episode for us today. For enabling that super team to create this free podcast for you, we are oh so very grateful to our sponsors. You can support this show by checking out our sponsors' links, which are in the show notes. And if you yourself would like to sponsor this podcast, you can get the details on how you can do that by going to johnkrohn.com/podcast. Otherwise, share this episode with people who you think would love it, review it on your favorite podcasting app or on YouTube. Subscribe if you're not already a subscriber, of course. And that's... But yeah, you can do any of those things, but most importantly, all I really care about is that you just keep on tuning in. I'm so grateful to have you listening. I hope I can continue to make episodes you love for years and years. Until next time, keep on rocking it out there, and I'm looking forward to enjoying another round of the Super Data Science Podcast with you very soon.